I'd never noticed how heavy the silence could be until I sat in his car, the engine humming softly beneath us, and watched the road stretch endlessly ahead. The world outside was a blur of streetlights and passing cars, but all I could hear was the low, almost mechanical hum of the tires on the pavement. His eyes were on the road, his grip steady on the wheel. I knew I should say something, anything to break the tension that seemed to thicken the air between us, but the words stuck in my throat like stones. "Thanks for the ride," I muttered, hoping it would sound casual, like the other times I had gotten in this car. But something was different tonight. He glanced over at me, his lips curling slightly into a smile. "Anytime," he said, but there was something in his tone, something strange, something that wasn't there before. It wasn't like I hadn't been in this situation before. 4 months, I'd been hitching rides with him, my best friend's boyfriend. It started innocently enough, just a favor when I missed the bus or when I was too tired to walk home after a late-night study session. At first, it was nothing more than a practical solution to a problem. But now it felt like something else. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The problem wasn't the rides themselves. No, it was the fact that every time I climbed into that car, he didn't take me home. He always drove me halfway, to a point where I'd need to walk the rest of the way. Never all the way. Not once. And tonight? I had no idea why I'd agreed to let him drive me again. "Are you sure you don't mind?" I asked, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted it to. I wasn't sure what I was asking. Whether I meant the ride itself or the lack of the final leg home. I didn't want to sound too inquisitive, but I couldn't help it. There was something about his silence that was beginning to weigh on me. Of course not. His voice was smooth, too smooth. I could hear the edge in his words, the one he tried to hide, the one he thought I wouldn't notice. And maybe I wouldn't have, if things hadn't been different lately. If I hadn't felt like I was constantly walking on a tightrope, teetering between the boundary of friendship and something much more complicated. Maybe I would have just accepted the ride and the silence for what it was, an easy, if slightly uncomfortable, routine. But something about tonight felt off, and I couldn't shake it. The city lights flickered by, casting long shadows across the inside of the car, and I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. "You've never asked me to go with you after dropping me off," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He didn't react immediately, keeping his eyes glued to the road. But I could see his jaw tighten. His grip on the steering wheel faltered for just a fraction of a second. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, he replied, "I like the quiet. Just want some time to think, you know?" I didn't know. In fact, I couldn't fathom what he was thinking about. I wondered if he realized how strange it was, how it seemed like he never had a real reason for why he didn't drive me the last leg home. It felt calculated. Deliberate, even. But it was such a small thing, wasn't it? It didn't seem like it would matter, until it did. I tried to focus on the rhythm of the car's movement, the passing of familiar streets that had always signified safety, familiarity, home. I had no reason to feel unsettled. I had known him for years. He had been my best friend's boyfriend since college, a nice guy, a little quiet at times, but solid. I had always trusted him, maybe too much. But now, with every ride, the air between us seemed to thicken, the space smaller. Every glance, every unspoken word, felt like a fracture in the foundation I thought we shared. This unspoken agreement that I would always be the one who got out first, that I would always be the one to walk away. I thought about my best friend, how she would feel if she knew I was riding in his car like this so often, alone. She'd never approve, not even for a second. She'd think I was trying to take something from her. I wasn't, though. I wasn't doing anything. Nothing that would matter, right? Are we almost there?" I asked, my voice quieter now, more tentative than before. "Almost," he replied, his tone clipped, his eyes still locked on the road. I knew I was asking the wrong questions. But I couldn't help it. Every time I was in this car with him, I felt the question hanging in the air, unspoken, yet so loud. Why didn't he ever take me home? There was a place we usually stopped at, the halfway point. It was a convenience store, tucked away in the corner of the city. It wasn't a bad place, but it was always dark, always a little too empty. And every time, I got out of the car, thanked him quietly, and then walked the rest of the way home. It had become routine. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment it would all change. Tonight felt different. There was a weight to the air, like he was waiting for something. Waiting for me to say something. But what could I say? What could I do to break the silence, to break this pattern we had created without acknowledging it? Before I could think any more about it, the car slowed, and we pulled into the parking lot of the convenience store. I looked out the window and saw the neon sign flickering above. "Same time next week?" he asked, his voice calm, but there was something there, something that made my stomach twist. I didn't answer immediately. I was still lost in the uncomfortable silence that had stretched out between us. Every part of me screamed to ask him, to demand to know why he always stopped here, why he never took me home. But something held me back. The fear of the unknown. The fear of what might happen if I asked. "Yeah," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Same time." I got out of the car without another word, shutting the door behind me. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I shivered, my breath clouding in the air. I turned and watched his car pull away, the headlights disappearing down the street. The silence of the night was all I had now. It wrapped itself around me, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't explain why, but everything about this routine was beginning to feel suffocating. The unspoken tension. The strange distance. The way he never took me home. And the way I kept getting in his car, like I was waiting for something to happen, like I was waiting for him to show me what he wasn't saying. But the answers didn't come. Not that night. As I walked the familiar path home, I wondered just how long I would keep pretending that nothing was wrong, that this was just another normal ride, just another casual favor. How long before the line between friendship and something else completely blurred beyond recognition? How long until it became impossible to pretend? I didn't know. But what I did know was that every ride home with him had become a question, and sooner or later, I was going to need an answer. The next week, I told myself it would be different. I told myself I wouldn't sit in the passenger seat, feeling like an outsider in my own life. I wouldn't allow the silence to stretch between us, making me feel more like a ghost than a friend. I had no reason to feel unsettled. None at all. But somehow, the disquiet still clung to me, like an unwanted shadow. The morning of our next ride, I almost convinced myself to cancel. It felt easier to pretend I wasn't a part of whatever was happening, whatever this was. But I didn't cancel. Because the thing was, I still liked having him drive me. I still liked the familiarity of it, the comfort. It was routine now, like a habit I couldn't shake, even if it didn't always sit right. I liked the sense of security it gave me, even though, deep down, I knew I shouldn't. And so, I stood outside my apartment building at the exact time I told him I would be ready. The cold wind cut through the fabric of my jacket, but I barely noticed it. My thoughts were racing, running circles around the real question that had been gnawing at me for days. What was this? When his car pulled up, the familiar black sedan gleamed under the streetlights, and for a moment, everything felt like it was slipping back into its routine. Just like before. I slid into the passenger seat, trying not to notice how my fingers trembled as I closed the door behind me. "Hey," I said, a little too brightly. "Thanks again for the ride." He nodded, barely sparing me a glance. He was already looking ahead, hands relaxed on the wheel. His calm exterior made it easier for me to convince myself that everything was fine. That we were fine. "Sure," he replied, his voice flat but polite. "No problem." But there was something in the way he said it that made my skin prickle. It was too casual, too detached. Like he was just going through the motions. I didn't ask if he was taking me home this time. Part of me didn't want to know the answer. It was safer to just let things happen and try to pretend I wasn't feeling like I was playing a part in some quiet drama, where the lines were getting blurry, and I wasn't sure who the other characters were. The car rolled down the street, the city slipping past us, its bright lights flickering as though they were trying to catch our attention. We didn't speak for a long while, the silence now stretching comfortably between us. Too comfortably. The familiar buzz of the engine filled the space, and I tried to focus on the rhythm of the road beneath us. I tried to ignore the discomfort that tightened in my chest. But when we reached the usual halfway point, the small convenience store that always marked the end of the ride, something felt different. He didn't slow down. I watched the store slide past, the neon sign still flickering lazily in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "aren't you going to stop?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he kept driving, his eyes fixed ahead. I could feel the tension tightening in my stomach, the weight of the silence suddenly unbearable. The car's engine was the only sound between us now. "Why are you still driving?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. There it was, the one thing I'd been too afraid to ask before. But tonight, it felt like I couldn't avoid it any longer. He glanced at me then, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might say something. Something that would explain all of this. But all he said was, "I thought we'd go somewhere else tonight." I didn't know how to respond. My throat felt tight. Somewhere else? That was new. But I couldn't decide if it was a good kind of new or a dangerous kind. Where? I asked, unable to keep the suspicion out of my voice. I thought you might want to take a little drive, he said, his tone light, but his eyes flickered nervously over to me before quickly returning to the road. I know you like the quiet. I felt my heart pound in my chest. It wasn't the answer I had been expecting. The silence returned then, a thick, suffocating silence that only deepened the questions I hadn't been able to ask. Why didn't he just take me home? Why was he acting so strange? Why couldn't I stop feeling like I was in the middle of something I wasn't supposed to be a part of? I couldn't tell if he was being evasive or if he genuinely thought I wouldn't care about the change in routine. And that was the worst part. I didn't know what he thought of me anymore, or what I thought of him. All the lines between us were beginning to blur in ways I wasn't sure I could handle. We drove through the city, the lights blending together into a blur of color, a cityscape that was starting to feel alien to me. Every turn felt deliberate, like he was taking me somewhere specific. But where? I wanted to ask, but I didn't. I couldn't. Because asking would only make it worse. I turned my gaze out the window, watching the world pass by, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I wanted to stop this ride, stop these strange feelings, but I didn't know how to. Part of me was terrified that I already knew what was happening, but the other part of me was too afraid to acknowledge it. The further we went, the further we moved from the life I knew. From the boundaries I had set, from the line between friendship and something else. But I couldn't turn back now. Not yet. He slowed as we approached a part of the city I didn't recognize. The streets were quieter here, more desolate. A shiver ran down my spine. What's going on? I asked, this time more forcefully, unable to hold back the questions any longer. Where are we going? He glanced over at me again, his expression tight now. For a moment, I thought he might tell me everything. But all he said was, just trust me. I know where we're going. I didn't trust him. Not completely. But I didn't have a choice but to follow. To keep quiet and wait for whatever was coming next. And as we drove further into the unknown, I realized that I had been letting myself get swept up in something I didn't fully understand, and now, I wasn't sure I could get out of it. At least, not without confronting everything that had been building up between us for months. We turned down another unfamiliar street, the dim glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty roads. I stared out the window, trying to make sense of everything that had been happening. My mind raced with questions I was too afraid to voice out loud. The city had changed around us, the noises of everyday life muted in the quiet corners we now found ourselves in. The buildings were old here, crumbling in places, like forgotten memories left to decay. I couldn't remember how long we'd been driving, but it felt like hours, though I knew it hadn't been. My chest tightened with every turn, every sign that this wasn't just another ride to nowhere. I finally looked over at him. His hands were still steady on the wheel, the lines on his face more etched than I remembered. He seemed distant in a way that wasn't just the usual quietness. It was something else, something colder. But the coldness wasn't in his words, it was in the way he was no longer looking at me. I wasn't sure when that shift had happened, but I could feel it now. We were no longer friends. We weren't anything. You've been acting weird, I said before I could stop myself. He didn't respond right away, but the muscles in his jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to me briefly, like he was gauging how serious I was. Then, he said, I've been fine. Fine. The word didn't sit well with me. It felt like an empty answer, one that he thought would end the conversation. But I wasn't going to let it end there. Not tonight. Don't you think this is weird? I pressed, my voice more intense than I intended. Taking me on a drive to God knows where, not saying anything, not even taking me home. What is this, exactly? His grip on the wheel tightened, and I could feel the tension in his shoulders, the kind of tension that came with holding something in, something that was too difficult to let out. It's just a drive, he muttered, like it was something I should already understand. Nothing more. But I knew better than that. I wasn't stupid. We'd been driving for far too long to call this just a drive. A drive didn't take you down forgotten roads to parts of the city where no one ever went. A drive didn't come with this kind of silence between two people who should have had something to talk about. You're lying, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the sharpness of truth in it. This isn't just a drive. And this isn't just nothing. You've been acting strange for weeks. And I keep asking myself why, but I never get an answer. So now I'm asking you. What's going on? He didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, I thought he might just keep driving, pretending I wasn't even there. But finally, he slowed the car to a stop in front of a decrepit building, one I didn't recognize at all. The windows were boarded up, the door covered with a thin veil of dirt and dust, as though it hadn't been touched in years. "Get out," he said flatly, his voice suddenly cold. My stomach dropped at his words, and I didn't even know why. The abruptness of it, the sudden authority in his tone, shocked me. This was not the guy I had known, the one who had always been careful with his words, careful with his tone. This felt like a different person, and it scared me in a way that I couldn't explain. "What? Are you serious?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "I said get out," he repeated, more forcefully this time. The words hung in the air like a challenge. I didn't know what to do. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I didn't move to open it. I felt paralyzed, unsure of what was happening or why he was behaving this way. There was a part of me that wanted to open the door and run as fast as I could. But there was also another part of me, the part that had trusted him for so long, that made me hesitate. "Why?" I whispered, my voice quieter this time. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as if gathering himself before answering. But when he did, the words were laced with something darker than I had ever heard in his voice. "You're not supposed to know what this is." His words hit me like a slap. Not supposed to know? I had been trying to figure out what was going on for weeks, but suddenly, he was telling me I wasn't supposed to know? My mind spun, desperately trying to make sense of his words. "Not supposed to know?" I repeated, barely able to comprehend what he was saying. "What do you mean? Why am I here?" He turned his head to look at me, and I could see it then, the shift. It wasn't just the tension in his body. It was his eyes, no longer the eyes of the person I had once known. There was something else there now, something unfamiliar and distant, something I couldn't quite reach. "Because you're not part of this," he said, his voice soft but firm, as if it was something I was supposed to understand. The words hit me with a sharp sting. "Not part of this? What the hell are you talking about?" But his face remained unreadable, and I couldn't read him anymore. "You were never meant to be part of this," he repeated, but this time, there was a finality to it. "Now, just get out." I stared at him, the coldness of his words freezing me in place. I had no idea what was happening, or how I had gotten here, but I knew one thing for sure, I was no longer in control. He was taking me somewhere I didn't belong, and I didn't know how to stop it. A rush of confusion and betrayal slammed into me, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The man I had known, the man I had trusted, he was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone who was pushing me away without any explanation. I reached for the door handle, feeling like I was walking in someone else's shoes. Everything felt foreign now. But when I stepped out of the car, the world outside was just as unfamiliar. The building in front of me seemed to loom larger, darker. It felt like a threshold, a door I wasn't meant to cross. But I had already crossed it, whether I wanted to or not. He didn't say anything as I stood there on the sidewalk, staring at the boarded-up building in front of me. I wanted to scream at him, to ask him why he was doing this to me, but the words stuck in my throat. And then, without another word, he drove off, leaving me standing in the darkness, alone, with more questions than answers. I stood there on the sidewalk, the chilly night air wrapping around me like a cold, suffocating blanket. The car's tail lights vanished around the corner, leaving behind nothing but the echo of the engine's hum, and a sharp emptiness where his presence had been. The world felt eerily still now. The distant hum of traffic seemed to grow fainter as I stood there, not knowing where to go or what to do. The weight of everything hit me all at once, crashing down on me with a force I wasn't prepared for. What had just happened? I couldn't make sense of it. For the longest time, I just stood there, frozen in place, trying to make sense of everything. I replayed his words in my mind, the cold finality in his tone. "You were never meant to be part of this." Those words echoed louder and louder in my mind, a reminder of everything that had shifted, everything that had changed between us. I didn't understand. It didn't make sense. We'd been friends for years. I trusted him in ways I didn't trust anyone else. And yet here I was, standing in the middle of a street, completely and utterly confused. I felt like a stranger in my own life. How had we gotten here? The thought hung in my mind like a question with no answer. I glanced up at the building in front of me again, its windows dark and empty, a hollow shell of something that had once been. The shadows it cast on the street felt like they were closing in, suffocating me with their heaviness. I needed to move. But where would I go? I turned around slowly, my feet taking hesitant steps toward the sidewalk, moving as if they had a mind of their own. I wasn't sure if I was walking in any particular direction, or if I was just trying to put distance between myself and the mess I had been thrust into. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart, drowning out everything else. Why did he leave me there? I wanted to scream. Why did he say those things? But I didn't scream. I kept walking. I wasn't sure where I was going. There was a part of me that wanted to go back, to find him again and force him to tell me what was going on. But the other part of me, the part that felt betrayed, the part that felt like I had been thrown away without warning, was telling me to keep moving forward. To never look back. I felt like I was walking into a fog, the world around me becoming more and more distorted with every step I took. The sidewalk stretched out before me, endless and empty. It felt like I had been abandoned in the middle of nowhere. Alone. I finally stopped in front of a small cafe. Its neon sign flickered dimly, casting a weak glow over the street. It wasn't a place I frequented, but it was somewhere I could go to just sit and try to gather my thoughts. I didn't want to be alone out here, but I didn't want to face anyone I knew either. The bell on the door jingled as I stepped inside, the warmth of the cafe enveloping me. The interior was cozy, with low light and small tables scattered around the room. A couple sat at the far corner, talking quietly, while the barista behind the counter glanced up at me. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment, probably noticing the disheveled state I was in, but she didn't say anything. She just smiled softly and went back to what she was doing. I walked to the farthest table, near the window, and sat down. My fingers instinctively reached into my jacket pocket, pulling out my phone. I unlocked it, hoping to see a message from someone, anyone. Maybe a text from my best friend, maybe even a call from him, apologizing for what had happened. But there was nothing. A part of me knew I shouldn't be surprised. After all, I had been left standing there with no explanation, no apology, nothing but his cryptic words hanging in the air. But the silence on the other side of the screen made everything feel worse. I set the phone down on the table, feeling an overwhelming emptiness welling up inside of me. I didn't know what I was hoping for anymore. What was there left to say? What was there left to do? Can I get you something? The barista's voice broke through my thoughts. I looked up at her and shook my head. No, I'm good. Thanks. She nodded and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts once more. I stared out the window, my mind a swirling mess of confusion, anger, and disbelief. How did I get here? I couldn't stop asking myself that. I wanted to go back to before this all started, to the easy days when everything had made sense. But I knew I couldn't go back. I had crossed a line, and there was no way to undo it. No way to erase the way things had changed between us. A small part of me kept hoping that I would wake up from this nightmare, that I would find myself back in the car with him, the familiar warmth of his presence beside me. But I knew that wasn't going to happen. That man I had known wasn't there anymore. I had seen the cracks in his facade. And I had a feeling they were only the beginning of what was to come. I glanced at my phone again, almost instinctively. There were no messages from him, no calls. Not even a missed text. The emptiness of it made my chest tighten, a cold weight sinking into my stomach. I had given him so much, my trust, my time, everything. And for what? To be abandoned in a city I didn't even recognize anymore? I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind running in circles, my thoughts stuck in an endless loop. There were too many things I didn't understand, too many questions left unanswered. And the more I tried to make sense of it all, the less sense it made. I needed to find answers. I needed to know what had happened. And I needed to know why he had driven me here, why he had left me in this strange place, with no explanation. The unanswered questions swirled in my mind, relentless, each one feeding into the next, until I was trapped in a whirlwind of confusion. And as I sat there in that quiet cafe, alone with my thoughts, I realized something. The answers weren't going to come easily. I wasn't going to find clarity by sitting around waiting for it. But no matter how hard I tried to avoid it, I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't done with this yet. Not by a long shot. And I couldn't leave until I had the answers I was desperate for. The night stretched on, hours slipping by unnoticed as I sat in the cafe, absorbed by the swirling storm of confusion in my mind. The soft hum of background chatter, the clink of coffee cups, and the distant hiss of the espresso machine barely registered. My phone had remained silent, taunting me with its emptiness. The absence of any new messages, any acknowledgement from him, gnawed at me, leaving me with a feeling of complete abandonment. How could someone you had trusted, someone who had been part of your life for so long, suddenly turn into a stranger in the span of one night? My thoughts raced in circles, but nothing made sense. I had to face it. I wasn't going to get the answers I wanted by waiting for him to come to me. I could sit here forever, hoping he'd call, hoping he'd explain himself, but I knew that was foolish. No one who treated you the way he had would just come back and apologize. People didn't do that. People didn't vanish into the night and leave you with cryptic words and then reappear like nothing had changed. I had to take control of this, somehow. I had to find the answers for myself. But how? I glanced down at my phone again, the temptation to send a message, to ask him what the hell was going on, almost overwhelming. But what good would that do? He had made his stance clear. He wasn't going to answer me. He wasn't going to give me the explanation I was begging for. And even if I somehow did get a response, I knew it would be another lie, another attempt to push me further away from the truth. I couldn't keep chasing a person who no longer wanted to be found. I pushed my phone away, a little harder than necessary, the sudden movement startling me out of my own thoughts. The thought of confronting him seemed impossible now. After everything, what was there left to say? What could I even say that would change what had already happened? He had already made his choice, and maybe it was time for me to make mine. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked toward the door. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay here anymore. The quiet of the cafe, the familiarity of the city, it all felt stifling. I needed to move. I needed to walk away from this night, from the confusion, from the hurt. Maybe that was the only way I could begin to understand what had happened. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face, sharp and crisp. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my thoughts, but the questions were still there, swirling around in my head. The city felt so large now, its streets unfamiliar, its shadows hiding secrets I didn't want to know. But I had to face them. I had to stop running away. I walked without thinking, my feet moving of their own accord, guiding me through the darkened streets. It wasn't long before I found myself on a bridge overlooking the river, the quiet flow of water beneath me calming, in a way. It was peaceful here, the soft ripple of the water reflecting the moonlight, the hum of the city a distant background noise. And in that moment, standing there on the bridge, I felt an unexpected clarity. Maybe I didn't need him to explain everything. Maybe the answers I was looking for didn't lie in him, but in me. I had been so wrapped up in trying to understand his actions, in trying to make sense of why he had done this to me, that I had forgotten to ask myself why I had let him control so much of my peace. He was gone. And it hurt. But maybe the hurt wasn't the most important part anymore. The most important part was how I moved forward from here. How I learned to move on, to trust myself again. To reclaim my own peace. The wind tugged at my hair, and I closed my eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over me. I wasn't sure where I was going next, or what I was going to do, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let him dictate my happiness any longer. I wasn't going to wait for an explanation that might never come. I deserved more than that. With a deep breath, I turned and walked away from the river. The night felt different now. The city felt different. The weight that had been pressing on me all night seemed to lift, just a little. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And that was enough.